Halo 5 is perhaps the most controversial Halo game to date. Halo 4 and Halo Reach might have been controversial too, but not on the same level as Halo 5. Why is that? Is it because the game was unfinished on launch? Is it because of microtransactions? Is it because of how the game looks? Well, actually all of these, but most importantly, because it tried too hard to please players who weren't Halo players. And in that it succeeded, but at what cost?
What did it cost?
Everything.
It strayed too far away from what made Halo, well, Halo. It adopted gameplay mechanics from other games like Call of Duty or Titanfall. All of those mechanics damaged the Halo formula significantly. Now it's 2018, and we're stuck in this awkward scenario where we can't go back to the classic without displeasing the modern fans, and we also can't stick to the modern since the community has been very vocal about their distaste with Halo 5. This got me thinking, how can 343 please both fans? How can 343 please fans on both sides? How can they strike a balance between modern and classic Halo? Well, this is a big question, and one that I don't think I can tackle myself. So I teamed up with some other great Halo YouTubers so we can together come up with a way to make a Halo game for everyone. Turn by turn between our guests, so let's start with the man who was one of the first to speak up to Halo 5's flaws, the Act Man. So let's hear what he has to say.
What's up everybody, this is the Act Man here, and today I'd like to thank Mr. Macho for having me on his channel to talk about if 343 could potentially recapture the same magic from the old Halo games without alienating fans of the new games. So the question is, how can 343 strike a good balance that pleases both old and new fans, you know? Because we have the two distinct styles. Classic Halo is more focused on aiming gunfights without the need for sprint, ADS thrusters, or anything like that. And the newer games are more reliant on sprint and movement-based mechanics, which spice things up and add some variables to the gameplay. So how can they balance it out? Is that even possible? Well, to be honest, I don't think it is, because by shifting to this new style, you've essentially set a new paradigm. And with Halo 5, people are going to expect the game to be like Halo 5. They're going to expect Halo Infinite to carry on what Halo 5 started. And so if the game were to do a complete 180 and go back to the classic style, well, it would not only be jarring, but it just wouldn't really make sense. I've said it before, the Halo series needs some stability. You know, each sequel can't be so radically different from the rest. So it's pretty difficult to be able to please both classic and new fans, because you can't essentially make two different types of games and just separate them into two different components, like go to this playlist for classic gameplay, go to this playlist for new gameplay. No, it can't work that way, because the game has to be made a certain way. Because when it comes to things like aim assist and projectile versus hit scan, you can't really tune these things separately for two different experiences. It's just not feasible. But what I do think is possible is toning down the movement-based mechanics in Halo Infinite, so it's not as twitchy, you know? If possible, I'd say take out sprint completely. I realize this isn't all that possible, but it would really open up a whole lot of freedom and give the developers more leeway when creating their maps. You know, so my first thing is tone down the movement-based mechanics and try to find a nice balance between just normal movement and these things that amplify the gameplay and, you know, add some versatility. I think Halo Reach, despite its flaws, had a somewhat good formula in this respect. Yes, armor abilities were flawed and they kind of fucked with the map design, but this is where Halo Infinite can take a different turn. By having these armor abilities, or whatever they might be, power-ups on each map, instead of having loadouts where, say, everyone can choose a jetpack on this map at the start of the game, specifically make each map with these types of armor abilities or power-ups in mind. I'd say just put them on the map as something similar to like overshields or the damage boost, you know? And that way there's more versatility in each map. My second suggestion would be more creative maps, right? More interactive maps. What if instead of all the movement mechanics we have in Halo 5, what if the Spartans had a suit, that would adapt to the environment they're in. I don't know, you can imagine your own scenarios, but just as an example, let's say there's a map with ice, similar to Sidewinder. You know, and in typical video game fashion, you slip and slide on it. But what if the Spartan suit kind of locked onto the ice, and now your movement was changed because you're on ice now? Maybe it's you skate a little bit or something. I feel like being able to please both new and old fans lies in the map design and not overcomplicating the game with stuff like ground pound and thrusters and clamber and all this stuff. I think that's the way to do it, is focus more on the maps themselves and almost try to just recreate the type of gameplay that Halo 3 had, but with a modern twist. I think that's how you could please both new and old fans without taking such drastic measures, such as separating the games into classic and new components. Those are my thoughts. Thanks for having me on, Mr. Macho.
You're welcome, Act-Man. Thanks for the time, man. Okay, so he suggests a great idea that armor abilities should stay, but they should be integrated into the sandbox rather than the player's movement mechanics. Like, we can have abilities that are specific to certain maps. Maybe you have a thruster pack on a map with lots of parkour elements, a jetpack on a map with lots of elevation, and etc. You start with the basic movement mechanics and obtain these abilities through traversing around the map, and they would be limited, like say you can only thrust twice and then the thruster pack is gone. This would add a tactical element to the gameplay, where the player will have to make choices and be more conservative. This pleases old fans for obvious reasons, as well as not alienating the modern fans since the mechanics are still there. Just how you get them and use them is different. This is a great idea and huge props to the Ackman for suggesting it. Go check him out, links in the description. Let's move on to our second guest, one of the most humble and considerate Halo YouTubers, Taras, host of Late Night Gaming.
So striking a balance between classic Halo and modern Halo is very tough because Halo is, by its very nature, deeply rooted in more classic game design, where it's not about what you can do as a player, it's more about how smart you are as a player in the ways that you use the external sandbox. A lot of people use the term sandbox incorrectly. Sandbox does not refer to what you can do as a player. That's core gameplay. The sandbox is what is outside of you, the player. So, a sandbox idea, for example, would be the vehicles that you can find in Slayer, or the grav lifts that you can turn on and use to get to a higher ledge. The problem with introducing new gameplay systems like clamber, aiming down the sights, sprinting, and stuff like that is, bit by bit, you're stripping away power from the sandbox and you're giving it to the player, which is kind of the point. You are modernizing the gameplay, which is making the gameplay a little bit more accessible, a little bit less slow, a little bit just easier and more immediate. But the balance that you have to strike is that you're not taking abilities away from the sandbox. Halo 5 has a notable problem with that, in that you notice a lot of maps kind of play the same. There's not a lot of uniqueness between the maps, kind of like the older Halos. I think of High Ground, where it's this weird asymmetrical map where the beach has vehicles that the enemy team could use. You don't have interesting stuff like that in Halo 5 because there's too much going on the player's end. They have too many abilities that they can use to traverse the environment as they see fit. In my opinion, the best way to modernize Halo, while also making sure that it's respectful to the legacy, is enhanced mobility things need to be treated as utilities, not as mandatory gameplay systems. Like in Halo 5, you have a lot of maps where there's a lot of dead space, where it's just hallways that are so big. And the point is that in order to navigate them in a timely manner, you have to sprint. If you don't sprint, you're just wasting your time by walking across this massive hallway. That's not okay in my opinion, because that's forcing the player to use sprint as a necessity. Games kind of like Halo Reach treated sprint more so as a utility, where you had to pick it up in the environment, and even then it was very limited, which meant that your use of it had to be very conservative. Kind of like any sandbox element that you find in your environment in the older Halo games, whether it be picking up a sniper rifle and saving it on your back for later, enhanced mobility needs to be treated similarly as a utility, something that won't just completely compromise the experience. I don't have the exact answers ultimately, but I do believe that the best way to strike a balance between modern shooters and classic shooters for Halo is the focus needs to be on the external sandbox outside of the player. Core mobility cannot be the focus. The player should, instead of thinking about how they're going to chain movement abilities, they need to be thinking about what they can find and use in their external sandbox to help them get the edge on the enemy team.
Alright, I love the detail he went into for this. Now Taras's and Actman's ideas really work together. Taras did a great job explaining why the sandbox needs to be given power rather than the player. Now with the Actman's idea of having armor abilities in the sandbox, these two ideas go hand in hand. Thanks Taras for taking the time to answer the question, seriously it means a lot. Now let's move on to our third guest, the man who's been in the Halo YouTube community since the days of Halo 4, Sean, host of Forge Labs.
I think it's a big misconception that classic Halo can't feel modern. I think that's just inherently untrue. Classic Halo can feel very much so modern, with a couple slight tweaks to field of view and some slight movement speed increases, and you've got classic Halo that feels like any other modern shooter. Not to get into the big debate about sprint and armor abilities, but you could, and people have made a very good case as to why sprint actually slows down the gameplay pace. Among many reasons, you now have to artificially enhance the size of maps. Players technically have two movement speeds, regular running and sprinting, so you need to compensate for both, and that requires you to make a larger than necessary map, and as such, the gameplay becomes less focused. That is a huge debate on its own, and I won't touch on that too much, but 343 could easily take classic Halo and make it fit the modern standard with just a few slight tweaks. Like I said, one of the biggest things they can do is just slightly increase the field of view. Eldorado on PC gave an option for increasing the field of view, and when doing that and using more or less the Halo 3 sandbox to an extent, it made it feel fast-paced and modern, and that's just one small little thing. Obviously, the aiming mechanics and that sort of thing could be tidied up a little bit to make it feel less dated, and just little things like that would make a significant difference, and I think that would beautifully adhere to both classic Halo fans as well as modern Halo fans. And as I've always said, I think the most important thing in Halo is options. I don't want to completely omit some of the stuff from the newer games. I like all that stuff to remain, but possibly just be optional. That way players can kind of choose how they want to go about it. I know that poses some inherent risks, but I still think it's important to always have options.
So Sean's perspective on this is very, very good. He says that we don't need a complete overhaul and it's not too hard to please both sides. All it would take is to go back to the classic and tidy it up by integrating some new elements, which I totally agree with. I think he's completely right about how something as little as the field of view can completely change the gameplay experience. I personally noticed this when I started playing Halo Combat Evolved on PC with a higher FOV. The game felt significantly more fast-paced, especially with CE's floaty movement, even though I was moving at the same speed. He suggests that the aiming would need some rework, which I again agree with. Great response, Sean. Now our final guest is the lore master himself, who knows pretty much all there is to know about Halo lore, Ian from Halo Canon.
Striking a balance is a tough task, to say the least, and not everyone will ever be satisfied. I think, though, the best approach would be something of a modified Halo 5. First, remove sprint and up the base movement speed. Not necessarily to Doom 2016 levels, but something akin to that. Sprint is the bane of classic Halo, and I think so long as people can move fast, they'll adapt and accept this change. Second, keep Spartan abilities, or something similar to it. Add, remove, tweak them as necessary, but I don't think they're inherently non-Halo, and certainly add different levels of fun to the game. Beyond that, perhaps making these social and ranked playlists more along the lines of modern and classic could potentially allow 343 to give everyone what they want, at least to some degree. Again, it won't satisfy everyone, but I think this could strike a reasonable balance.
So Ian has a very different approach to the rest, which is rather than going back completely to classic, we build off of Halo 5's gameplay, adding and removing things from it. Firstly, I think we can all agree with him on the fact that sprint damages Halo. Taras and Sean also said that it slows down the gameplay rather than speed it up, which it creates the illusion of. Ian suggests that we can compensate for the lack of sprint with a faster base movement speed. It makes a lot of sense since A, the player can shoot at all times while moving, and B, it'll be fast enough to fit into modern FPS games without being too slow. Now Ian does say that we can't please everyone, and let's be honest here. The Halo community can never be happy. A lot of them are just blind haters. But to the actual fans who have been giving actual meaningful feedback, this type of gameplay would very well please them. Alright, so now it's time for my irrelevant opinion. So what I'm gonna do is take all of the answers from the guests, combine them into one answer, as well as add my own to it. Okay, so Halo needs to go back to its roots, while integrating some of the new elements in. Sprint needs to go away, no one will miss it, I promise you. Instead, a higher base movement will not only solve the issue, but also be much more fun to use. The power needs to be rebalanced between the sandbox and the player. Armor abilities should be one-time use items, which would be obtained through the map rather than spawned with. Vehicles should be used to move long distances rather than sprint. Gravity lifts should be used instead of clamber. Power weapons such as the gravity hammer should be used instead of Spartan charge for close quarters. Ground pound can stay, it isn't inherently broken or overpowered, and it fits quite well into Halo. There are multiple scenarios that call for ground pounding as a useful feature, so in my opinion it should stay. Well guys, there it is. Here's some of the big Halo people's opinions on how Halo can be enjoyable for the newcomers as well as for the classic fans. It can create an enjoyable experience for all of us, hopefully restoring peace to the community. This collaboration has been in the works for very long. Obviously all of these guys had obligations and needed time for those. I'll leave links to their channels in the descriptions. Definitely go subscribe to them if you aren't already. And hey, while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe to me. I'd love to have more of you guys around for more awesome videos. That's all I have for today. Leave a like and comment. I'll see you all later, so stay machoic.